most relationships end long before anyone says goodbye. There's a moment in every relationship that ends when no one is looking. Not during a fight, not after a betrayal, but in the quiet accumulation of small, unspoken shifts that reshape everything beneath the surface. Emotional distance doesn't announce itself. It forms gradually, in the spaces between words, in the silences that last too long, in the absence of gestures that used to come naturally. By the time it's visible, it's already been building for weeks, sometimes months. This isn't about dramatic collapse. It's about behavioral patterns that repeat until they become the new structure of the bond. And most people miss it because they're looking for the wrong signs. They're waiting for something obvious, something confrontational, something they can name and address. But emotional withdrawal doesn't work that way. It operates in the realm of psychology, not spectacle. In rhythm, not rupture. Relationship psychology reveals something uncomfortable. The emotional behavior that signals the end often begins long before conscious awareness catches up. Attachment patterns start to reorganize. Psychological dynamics shift from reciprocal to one-sided. The person who was once present becomes subtly unavailable, not through absence, but through a reduction in emotional investment that's nearly impossible to confront. And the one experiencing this change is left navigating a reality that doesn't match what's being said, trying to make sense of distance that's undeniable but unexplained. This is where behavior analysis becomes essential, because actions over time reveal what words never will. The ending doesn't happen in a single moment. It unfolds across a series of micro-shifts, each one small enough to dismiss, but collectively significant enough to redefine everything. And by the time both people realize what's happened, the relationship has already crossed a threshold it can't return from. This isn't a story about blame. It's an investigation into how emotional distance forms, how it compounds, and how it reshapes the lived experience of a bond without ever becoming the explicit subject of conversation. It's about the gap between what's felt and what's acknowledged, between what's observable and what's being named. And it's about the quiet, private reckoning that happens when someone finally stops interpreting their relationship through hope and starts seeing it for what it consistently is. Not what it was, not what it could be, but what it has proven itself to be, through sustained, repeating evidence. That moment of clarity, when perception aligns with reality, is where the real ending begins. Everything after that is just acknowledgement. There's a moment that arrives without announcement. It doesn't come from a fight, a confession, or a piece of evidence left behind. It forms somewhere deeper, quiet, unwitnessed, and strangely certain. This kind of clarity doesn't ask for validation. It doesn't need someone else to confirm what the body already knows. It emerges from the accumulated weight of small inconsistencies, the kind that don't register consciously at first, but settle into the nervous system over time. The mind may still be searching for reasons, but something beneath thought has already shifted. This is where emotional behavior begins to separate from the narrative being told. What was once fluid now feels slightly off-center, and the person experiencing it can't yet name why. But the sensation is undeniable. Something foundational has moved. This internal shift operates outside the usual markers of relationship collapse. There's no dramatic rupture, no clear turning point to circle on a calendar. Instead, it's a psychological recalibration that happens in silence. The brain begins piecing together fragments it had previously dismissed. Tones of voice, timing of replies, the quality of presence when physically near. These aren't conclusions yet. They're impressions forming in the background, shaping perception before language catches up. Relationship psychology describes this as pre-conscious pattern recognition, where the emotional system detects misalignment faster than the rational mind can process it. The person isn't choosing to feel distant. They're responding to something their attention hasn't fully isolated yet. And because it lacks external proof, it often gets buried under self-doubt. What makes this moment so disorienting is its lack of drama. There's no betrayal to point to, no obvious neglect to defend against. It simply feels like standing in a room that used to be warm and noticing for the first time that the temperature has dropped. The other person may not have changed visibly. Their words might still sound familiar, but the emotional frequency has shifted, and the body registers it before the mind can articulate it. This is where attachment patterns begin to show strain, not through conflict, but through the quiet erosion of felt security. The person starts to notice they're compensating, filling gaps they didn't realize had formed. They might dismiss it as stress, timing, or circumstance, but the internal knowing persists, humming beneath every interaction. And once that clarity forms, it doesn't disappear. It lingers in the margins of conversation, in the pauses that last a second too long, in the absence of something that used to be automatic. The person begins to observe their own reactions differently, wondering why a text takes longer to send, why certain questions feel heavier to ask. They're not analyzing the relationship yet. They're noticing themselves within it, and that noticing changes everything. The dynamic hasn't collapsed, but it's no longer invisible. Something quiet has surfaced, and now the question becomes whether it will be acknowledged, or whether it will continue building in silence, waiting for the next signal to arrive. The first signal is easy to ignore. The second gets filed under coincidence. By the third, the fourth, the 10th, the mind stops offering excuses and starts cataloging instead. This is when relationship dynamics begin to shift from isolated incidents to recognizable patterns. A delayed response becomes a trend. A lack of initiation becomes a posture. What once felt like occasional distance now registers as a behavioral baseline. The person isn't searching for problems. They're simply noticing that the same shape keeps appearing in different contexts. And at some point, the repetition becomes louder than any single explanation. The brain, wired to detect consistency, starts treating these signals not as anomalies, but as data. And data, when it repeats, builds a case that no amount of rationalization can fully dismantle. This accumulation doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, layered, almost invisible until it isn't. Each signal alone might mean nothing, but when they start forming a sequence, the psychological system begins to respond differently. Emotional behavior that once felt warm now feels measured. Conversations that used to flow now require more effort to sustain. The person begins to notice not just what's said, but what's consistently avoided. Not just presence, but the quality of that presence. They start to feel the difference between someone who's engaged and someone who's performing engagement. And once that distinction becomes clear, it's nearly impossible to unsee. The mind tries to protect the bond by offering context, stress, work, fatigue, but the body keeps score, and the score doesn't lie. What makes these signals so difficult to dismiss is their lack of aggression. There's no hostility, no cruelty, no obvious withdrawal. Just a slow, steady reduction in emotional availability that feels too subtle to confront. Attachment patterns respond to this kind of ambiguity with confusion. The person wants to trust their perception, but there's nothing concrete to hold on to. So, they wait. They observe. They collect more evidence, hoping that eventually the picture will either resolve or dissolve. But instead, it sharpens. Each new interaction either confirms the pattern or deepens the uncertainty. And that uncertainty, sustained over time, becomes its own kind of answer. The relationship hasn't ended, but the emotional dynamics have quietly reorganized around a new center of gravity. By the time the signals have accumulated into something undeniable, the person has often spent weeks, sometimes months, trying to make sense of what they're feeling. They've tested their perception, second-guessed their sensitivity, wondered if they're overreacting. But the pattern keeps surfacing, persistent and patient. And eventually, the internal narrative shifts. It's no longer about whether something is wrong. It's about what that something means, and whether it's being seen by anyone else. The question stops being, "Am I imagining this?" and becomes, "How long has this been happening?" That shift marks a turning point, not in the relationship itself, but in how the person relates to it. They're no longer waiting for clarity, they're standing in it. Emotional withdrawal doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a statement or a sudden change in routine. More often, it seeps in slowly, like a tide pulling back 1 inch at a time. The person on the other side doesn't feel abandoned. They feel slightly less prioritized. Not ignored, but no longer centered. It's the kind of shift that's easy to miss in real time because it never crosses into obvious neglect. The other person is still there, still responding, still participating. But something in the texture of their presence has changed. They're available, but not quite accessible. Present, but not fully engaged. And because the change is so incremental, it's hard to pinpoint when it actually began. It just becomes the new normal, until one day the person realizes they've been adjusting to it without ever naming it. This kind of gradual emotional distance operates beneath the surface of daily interaction. Conversations continue. Plans are still made. But there's a thinness to the connection that wasn't there before. The person begins to notice that certain types of emotional exchange, vulnerability, spontaneity, depth, now require more initiation on their part. What used to happen naturally now feels like something they have to create space for. And when they do, the response is often polite but distant, warm but not reciprocal. It's not rejection. It's something quieter. A recalibration of energy that hasn't been discussed or agreed upon, but is nonetheless being enacted. Relationship psychology recognizes this as a form of behavioral drift, where one person's emotional investment begins to contract while the other is still operating from the previous baseline. The subtlety of this shift is what makes it so psychologically destabilizing. There's no clear moment to confront, no obvious hurt to address, just a slow erosion of the relational rhythm that once felt effortless. The person starts to wonder if they're being too sensitive, if they're reading into things that don't exist. But their nervous system keeps registering the change. They feel it in the silences that last too long, in the conversations that end too quickly, in the absence of the small gestures that used to signal care. It's not that the other person has become cold. It's that they've become neutral. And neutrality, in a space that once held warmth, feels like a kind of loss. The emotional behavior hasn't shifted into hostility. It's shifted into maintenance. And maintenance, while functional, doesn't sustain attachment. What complicates this even further is that the person pulling back may not be aware they're doing it. They haven't made a conscious decision to withdraw. They're simply responding to something internal. Stress, uncertainty, their own unmet emotional needs, and that response is quietly reshaping how they show up. But for the person on the receiving end, the lack of intention doesn't soften the impact. They're left navigating a relationship that feels different without understanding why or whether it's even supposed to be addressed. The dynamic hasn't broken. It's just become unbalanced. And that imbalance, left unspoken, begins to widen the space between what was and what is now quietly becoming. The first time a text sits unanswered for hours, it's understandable. The second time, it's circumstance. By the fifth or sixth time, it's a pattern, but still one that can be explained away. This is where behavior analysis becomes difficult, because the changes are real, but not yet definitive. The person notices that responses take longer, that enthusiasm feels muted, that follow-through on small things has become inconsistent. But none of it is extreme enough to justify concern. So they rationalize. Work has been busy. Life has been overwhelming. Everyone goes through phases. And all of that might be true. But it's also true that responsiveness is a form of emotional language, and when that language changes, it signals something beneath the surface, whether or not that something is being consciously acknowledged. These early moments are marked by a quiet dissonance. The person wants to trust what they're being told, that everything is fine, that nothing has changed. But their lived experience keeps contradicting that message. They notice the shift in timing, in tone, in the quality of attention being offered. What used to feel reciprocal now feels one-sided. What used to be automatic now requires prompting. And because the other person hasn't said anything is wrong, the one noticing the change begins to question their own perception. Maybe they're being needy. Maybe they're overreacting. Maybe this is just what relationships look like after a certain amount of time. But underneath those doubts, the emotional system is registering something else. A consistent reduction in effort that hasn't been explained, only justified. This is where attachment patterns start to reveal themselves. Some people respond to diminished responsiveness by increasing their own, reaching out more, initiating more, trying to restore the previous rhythm through their own effort. Others begin to pull back in response, mirroring the distance they're receiving. Neither response changes the underlying dynamic. The shift has already occurred, and both people are now reacting to it from different positions. One is compensating, the other is withdrawing. And because neither is naming what's happening, the gap continues to widen in silence. The relationship hasn't failed yet, but the psychological dynamics are already reorganizing around a new, unspoken structure. What makes this phase so difficult is the absence of clarity. The person can feel the change, but they can't prove it. They can point to individual moments, but each one, in isolation, seems too small to matter. So they wait. They observe. They collect more data, hoping that eventually the picture will either resolve into something actionable or dissolve into paranoia. But the pattern persists, subtle and steady, reshaping the emotional landscape one small shift at a time. And by the time it becomes undeniable, the person has already spent weeks trying to talk themselves out of what they've been feeling all along. At some point, the mind stops cataloging individual events and starts recognizing structure. This is when relationship patterns become visible, not as a series of disconnected incidents, but as a repeating cycle with its own internal logic. the person begins to see that the same behaviors show up in the same contexts, following the same emotional rhythm. A certain kind of conversation always ends the same way. A certain type of request is always met with the same deflection. The specifics change, but the shape remains constant. And once that shape becomes clear, it's impossible to return to viewing each moment as random. The brain has identified a pattern, and patterns, by definition, are predictive. They tell you not just what has happened, but what will likely happen again. This recognition doesn't arrive with relief. It arrives with a quiet heaviness, because seeing the pattern means accepting that what's been happening isn't temporary or accidental. It's behavioral. It's consistent. And consistency in this context suggests something deeper than circumstance. The person starts to notice how certain emotional triggers reliably produce the same response: distance, deflection, silence. They see how certain needs, when expressed, are consistently unmet. Not through refusal, but through avoidance. Not through conflict, but through the absence of engagement. Psychological dynamics become readable in a way they weren't before, and that readability changes the entire relational experience. What once felt confusing now feels predictable, and predictability, while clarifying, also confirms what the person had been hoping wasn't true. The shift from isolated moments to recognized patterns is a psychological threshold. It's the difference between wondering if something is wrong and knowing that something has fundamentally changed. Behavior analysis at this level isn't about blame. It's about observation. The person isn't trying to vilify the other. They're trying to understand what's actually happening beneath the surface of daily interaction. And what they're finding is that emotional behavior, when tracked over time, reveals priorities. It shows where energy is being directed, where attention is being withheld, and where the relationship has quietly been reorganized around a new set of unspoken rules. The bond hasn't ended, but it's no longer operating from the same foundation it once did. What makes this phase so isolating is that the person experiencing it often can't share what they're seeing. The pattern is clear to them, but explaining it to someone else, especially the person at the center of it, feels impossible. How do you describe a shift in emotional availability when every individual moment seems defensible? How do you name a recurring absence when the other person is still technically present? The evidence is behavioral, not verbal. It's written in rhythm, in timing, in the accumulation of small withdrawals that never announce themselves, but collectively reshape the entire dynamic. And once that pattern is seen, it becomes the lens through which every future interaction is interpreted. The relationship hasn't collapsed, but the person's understanding of it has fundamentally shifted. There's a specific kind of disorientation that sets in when what you've been told no longer aligns with what you're experiencing. The words say one thing, the behavior says another. And somewhere in the space between those two realities, the person begins to lose their footing. They're told everything is fine, but the emotional temperature says otherwise. They're reassured that nothing has changed, but the consistency of presence has clearly shifted. This is where relationship psychology becomes deeply personal, because the confusion isn't just about the other person, it's about whether to trust one's own perception. The mind wants to believe what's being said, but the body, the nervous system, the accumulated experience of daily interaction, all of it points in a different direction. And that contradiction creates a low-grade internal conflict that's exhausting to sustain. This misalignment doesn't resolve through conversation, because the issue isn't a lack of communication, it's a gap between stated intention and enacted behavior. The person might express care verbally, but their actions reflect detachment. They might claim investment, but their emotional availability tells a different story. And because the discrepancy is ongoing, the one experiencing it begins to question everything. Are they expecting too much? Are they misreading the situation? Are they creating problems where none exist? The self-doubt becomes relentless, because there's no external validation for what's being felt. The other person isn't admitting distance, they're denying it. And that denial, sustained over time, becomes a form of gaslighting, not through malice, but through the refusal to acknowledge what's behaviorally evident. Attachment patterns respond to this kind of ambiguity with hypervigilance. The person starts monitoring every interaction more closely, searching for confirmation that what they're feeling is real. They analyze tone, timing, word choice, trying to build a case that will either validate their perception or disprove it entirely. But the evidence remains inconclusive, because the shift isn't dramatic, it's incremental. And incremental changes, while significant in accumulation, are easy to dismiss in isolation. So the person remains stuck in a loop of doubt and recognition, unable to fully trust what they're experiencing but equally unable to ignore it. The relationship continues, but the internal experience of it has become deeply unstable. What makes this phase particularly destabilizing is the absence of resolution. The person can't move forward because nothing has been confirmed, but they also can't go back to the way things were because too much has already shifted. They're caught between two realities, the one being presented to them and the one they're living through. And that tension, sustained over weeks or months, begins to erode not just the relationship, but the person's confidence in their own judgment. They start to wonder if they're the problem, if their sensitivity is distorting reality, if they're sabotaging something that could otherwise be fine. But beneath all that doubt, the knowing remains. The pattern is still there. The distance is still real. And no amount of reassurance changes the fact that something fundamental has already moved. At some point, the person realizes they've been carrying most of the weight. Not all of it, but enough that the relationship has quietly become asymmetrical. They're the one initiating conversations. They're the one checking in, planning, asking questions, creating space for connection. And while the other person responds, they rarely reciprocate. They participate, but they don't lead. They're present, but they're not driving the emotional momentum. This imbalance doesn't form overnight. It builds gradually, one small withdrawal at a time, until the person looks around and realizes they've been compensating for a lack of effort they didn't consciously agree to carry. And because there's been no confrontation, no explicit conversation about this shift, it feels impossible to address without sounding accusatory. This is where emotional withdrawal becomes structural rather than circumstantial. It's not that the other person has stopped caring entirely. It's that they've stopped investing at the same level. They've recalibrated their energy in a way that leaves the other person doing more to maintain the connection. Relationship dynamics like this are rarely intentional. The person pulling back may not even realize they're doing it, but the impact is the same. One person is now responsible for the relational labor that used to be shared. And that labor, when sustained over time, becomes exhausting. The person begins to feel less like a partner and more like a project manager, constantly monitoring the health of the bond and adjusting their behavior to keep it functional. What makes this imbalance so difficult to name is that it's not about one big failure. It's about 1,000 small absences. The other person hasn't done anything overtly wrong. They're still kind, still affectionate in moments, still willing to engage when prompted. But they've stopped being an active participant in the relationship's emotional maintenance. They've become reactive rather than proactive, and that shift, while subtle, changes everything. Emotional behavior at this stage begins to look like compliance rather than connection. The person shows up because they're asked to, not because they're internally motivated to. And for the one carrying the effort, that distinction is felt deeply, even if it's never spoken aloud. Eventually, the person begins to resent the imbalance, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. They start to wonder what would happen if they stopped initiating. Would the other person step in? Or would the relationship simply go quiet? And that question, once it surfaces, is hard to ignore. It reveals the underlying truth, that the connection is being sustained by one person's effort. And if that effort were withdrawn, the bond might not survive on its own. The relationship hasn't ended, but it's no longer mutual. And that lack of mutuality, left unaddressed, becomes the foundation for everything that follows. There's a strange adaptation that occurs when emotional distance persists long enough. At first it's alarming, then it's confusing, then gradually, it becomes normal. The person stops expecting the closeness that used to define the relationship and starts adjusting to the new baseline. They no longer feel surprised when texts go unanswered for hours. They no longer wait for spontaneous gestures of affection. They've learned the rhythm of this version of the connection, and while it's not what they wanted, it's become what they know. This is where psychological dynamics shift from resistance to accommodation. The person isn't happy with the distance, but they've stopped fighting it. They've stopped hoping it will change on its own. And in that acceptance, something fundamental shifts in how they relate to the bond itself. This familiarity doesn't mean the distance hurts less. It means the pain has been integrated into the structure of daily life. The person has learned to function around it, to expect less, to protect themselves by lowering their emotional investment. Attachment patterns respond to sustained unavailability by creating distance in return, not out of retaliation, but out of self-preservation. The nervous system stops reaching for what it's learned won't be there. The mind stops spinning narratives about why things have changed. There's a quiet resignation that settles in, and while it's not peace, it's a kind of stability. The relationship continues, but it's no longer characterized by longing or confusion. It's characterized by a muted, functional coexistence that neither person has explicitly chosen, but both have quietly accepted. What's most striking about this phase is how little emotion it seems to carry. The urgency is gone. The anxiety has faded. The person isn't constantly analyzing or searching for explanations anymore. They've simply adjusted their expectations to match the reality they've been living in. And while that adjustment might look like healing from the outside, it's actually a form of detachment. The person hasn't made peace with the distance. They've just stopped being surprised by it. They've stopped waiting for things to return to how they were. And in that shift, they've begun the psychological process of separating their sense of security from the relationship itself. The bond is still there, but it no longer holds the same emotional weight it once did. This is where the relationship enters a kind of liminal space. It hasn't ended, but it's no longer fully alive. Both people are still together, still going through the motions, but the emotional core has quietly gone dormant. And because the distance has become familiar, neither person feels the immediate pressure to address it. It's easier to live with what's known, even if what's known is hollow, than to confront what's been lost. The dynamic hasn't collapsed into conflict. It's settled into something quieter, something sustainable in its emptiness. And that quietness, while less painful than active turmoil, is its own kind of ending. When both people stop reaching for each other at the same time, the relationship enters a new phase. It's no longer just one person withdrawing, while the other compensates. Now both have pulled back. The person who was once carrying the effort has stopped initiating as much, either out of exhaustion or as a test to see what happens without their input. And what happens, more often than not, is silence. The other person doesn't step in to fill the gap. They don't notice the shift, or if they do, they don't respond to it. The conversations that used to happen daily now happen sporadically. The check-ins that used to feel automatic now require conscious effort from both sides. And that effort, increasingly, isn't being made. This is where relationship patterns become starkly visible, because the absence of mutual initiation reveals how little momentum the bond has left on its own. This decline doesn't happen with fanfare. There's no argument, no confrontation, no moment where someone announces they're stepping back. It's just a quiet, mutual withdrawal that unfolds over days or weeks. The person who used to send the first text in the morning stops doing it, and the other person doesn't pick it up. The one who used to plan time together stops suggesting it, and the calendar stays empty. Neither person is being malicious. They're both just tired. Tired of trying. Tired of wondering. Tired of carrying something that no longer feels reciprocal. And in that exhaustion, they both let go a little. Not all at once, but enough that the connection begins to fade from active engagement into passive coexistence. The relationship hasn't died, but it's no longer being nurtured by either person. What makes this phase so psychologically significant is that it marks a shift in emotional behavior on both sides. It's no longer about one person's withdrawal, it's about both people simultaneously deciding, whether consciously or not, that the effort required to maintain the bond is no longer worth the return. Emotional distance has become mutual, and that mutuality changes everything. There's no longer someone fighting to keep the connection alive. There's no longer someone compensating for the other's absence. Both people have quietly stepped back, and the space between them has widened without resistance. The dynamic has moved from imbalance to parallel disengagement, and that shift, while quieter than conflict, is often more final. The relationship at this stage exists in name more than in practice. Both people are still technically together, still occupying the same relational space, but the substance has drained out. They're no longer building toward anything. They're no longer investing in a shared future. They're simply existing alongside each other, waiting, perhaps unconsciously, for something to change, or for someone to finally name what's already happened. The emotional withdrawal is complete on both sides now, and what remains is a structure without a foundation. The bond hasn't been severed, but it's no longer being held. And in that absence of holding, the question becomes not whether it will end, but when. Eventually, the person stops interpreting the relationship through hope or memory, and starts seeing it for what it consistently is. Not what it was in the beginning, not what it could be under different circumstances, but what it has proven itself to be, day after day, through sustained behavioral evidence. This is where behavior analysis becomes unambiguous. The patterns are no longer emerging, they're established. The distance is no longer confusing, it's predictable. The person has accumulated enough data, over enough time, to form a revised understanding of the bond. And that understanding, while painful, is also clarifying. It removes the ambiguity that once made everything feel unstable. It replaces confusion with a quiet, grounded knowing. The relationship may not have ended, but the person's relationship to it has fundamentally changed. This revision doesn't happen through a single realization. It's the culmination of everything that's been observed, felt, and quietly absorbed over weeks or months. The person has watched how the other responds under pressure, how they handle vulnerability, how they show up, or don't, when it matters. They've seen what gets prioritized and what gets deferred. They've noticed what's said versus what's done, what's promised versus what's delivered. And all of that information has coalesced into a psychological profile of the relationship that's based not on potential, but on reality. Relationship psychology at this level is no longer about interpretation. It's about recognition. The person isn't guessing anymore. They're observing what's consistently true and adjusting their understanding accordingly. What makes this revised understanding so significant is that it shifts the person's position within the dynamic. They're no longer waiting for the relationship to return to what it was. They're no longer hoping the other person will change. They've accepted that the bond, as it currently exists, is the version they're being offered. And that acceptance doesn't mean they're okay with it. It just means they're no longer fighting reality. They're seeing it clearly, without the filter of attachment or expectation. And in that clarity, they begin to make different choices, not out of anger or retaliation, but out of alignment with what they now understand to be true. The relationship hasn't been redefined by conversation. It's been redefined by consistency. This is where the person begins to feel a quiet shift in their own emotional landscape. The anxiety that once accompanied every interaction starts to fade. The hypervigilance loosens. The need to monitor, analyze, and interpret every behavior diminishes. Not because things have improved, but because the person has stopped expecting them to. They've integrated the reality of the relationship into their understanding of it, and that integration brings a kind of peace, not the peace of resolution, but the peace of no longer being surprised. They know what this is now. They know what to expect. And in that knowing, they begin the internal process of deciding what comes next. The bond is still there, but it no longer holds the same gravitational pull. The person has stepped back just enough to see the whole picture, and what they're seeing is a relationship that has already, in many ways, ended. Long before anyone said the words. The ending was never one moment. It was a sequence. Small, repeating, undeniable. By the time distance becomes visible, it's already restructured everything beneath it. The relationship didn't collapse. It eroded. And that erosion, sustained over time, becomes the foundation of what no longer exists. Most people spend months trying to reverse what's already happened, searching for the version of the bond that stopped being real long before they were ready to accept it. But clarity doesn't arrive through hope. It arrives through observation, through the willingness to see patterns instead of exceptions, through the quiet, uncomfortable recognition that behavior, when consistent, is the most honest language a person speaks. What remains now isn't the question of whether something changed. It's the question of what you do with that knowledge. The relationship may still exist in form, but its substance has already shifted, and no amount of effort will restore what's been withdrawn on the other side. The only choice left is whether to continue inhabiting a bond that's already ended emotionally, or to align your position with what the behavior has been showing you all along. That alignment doesn't require confrontation. It doesn't require closure. It just requires honesty with yourself about what you've been living through. And once that honesty settles in, the path forward becomes clear. Not easy, but clear. But here's what most people miss. Emotional distance doesn't just accumulate slowly. Sometimes it shifts overnight. One day the person is present, the next they're not. And that sudden withdrawal, the kind that feels like it came out of nowhere, has its own psychological structure, its own internal logic. If you've ever experienced someone going cold without explanation, if you've ever been left wondering what happened between one conversation and the next, then you need to understand the psychology behind that shift. Because it's not random, it's not impulsive, and it's not about you. There's a pattern beneath it, a behavioral sequence that makes perfect sense once you know what to look for. I've broken that entire process down in the previous video. The psychology behind going cold overnight. It walks through exactly how that sudden distance forms, what triggers it, and why it feels so disorienting to the person on the receiving end. If this video resonated with you, that one will complete the picture. It's not about closure. It's about understanding. And understanding changes everything. Go watch it now. Then come back, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications. Because this is just the beginning of what we're unpacking here. This is where the real psychology lives.